A pandemic occurs when a disease turns into a global outbreak. The recent coronavirus, COVID-19, is now considered a pandemic. The deadly virus is affecting people all over the world. It is causing countries to close their borders, urge people to stay indoors, and order businesses to cease operations. However, this isn't the first time that a pandemic has affected so many lives at once. In this list, we'll check out some of the deadliest pandemics of the past. Number 10. Leprosy. Infection, otherwise known as Hansen's illness, is a moderate creating bacterial sickness that can prompt harm of the nerves, skin, eyes, and respiratory lot. Those contaminated by the illness may encounter helpless vision and muscle shortcoming. A few patients can presently don't feel torment, which may bring about the halfway loss of limits. The infection has influenced people for millennia, yet it turned into a pandemic in Europe during the Middle Ages. As they were considered to be messy, contaminated people needed to wear certain apparel or a chime to flag their appearance. Nonetheless, they were illegal to go to numerous areas. It is accepted that around 19,000 untouchable houses existed in Europe during this time. Called the living dead, outcasts were connected to sin and proclaimed lawfully dead by city pioneers who seized the possessions of the wiped out. There are still around 200,000 instances of sickness a year, however it would now be able to be relieved with medicine. Nonetheless, a few patients need progressing treatment for confusions like visual impairment and loss of motion. Number 9. The Russian influenza, otherwise known as Asiatic influenza, was a dangerous flu pandemic that murdered roughly 1 million individuals around the world. The flare-up began spreading in 1889 and was the biggest 19th century pandemic of flu. It was additionally the main genuine scourge that occurred in the time of bacteriology. The underlying cases were accounted for in Bukhara in Central Asia, Turkestan, Athabasca in northwestern Canada, and Greenland. Inside a half-year, the sickness had tainted St. Petersburg, Russia. Just 4 months after the fact, the flu had spread all through the northern side of the equator. Fast populous development in metropolitan zones across the globe assisted with making a pandemic. Number 8. The third cholera pandemic. The deadliest of the 7 cholera flare-ups was the third significant episode that kept going from 1852 to 1860. Much the same as the initial 2 pandemics, the third began in India and spread all through Asia, Europe, North America, and Africa. In 1854, the most exceedingly terrible year, cholera slaughtered 23,000 individuals in Great Britain. Around 10,000 of those casualties were from London. During the third cholera pandemic, around 1 million individuals lost their lives. Numerous passings came from Russia, Chicago, Tokyo, Spain, Venezuela, and Brazil. Tainted water was believed to be the reason for cholera. British Dr. John Snow followed cases in London and recognized defiled water as the reason for the transmission of the illness. He followed the water to the Broad Street siphon and persuaded nearby authorities to eliminate the siphon handle. Albeit the amount of neighborhood cases drastically diminished after his discoveries, the numbers kept on ascending in different regions of the world for a couple of more years. Number 7. Smallpox. For quite a long time, smallpox was a threat in Europe, Asia, and Arabia. 3 of each 10 tainted individuals kicked the bucket. The main European voyagers carried the infection to the New World, where individuals were not resistant to the sickness. Individuals of current Mexico and the United States saw passing rates a lot higher than those of the Old World. Some episodes of smallpox were viewed as scourges. Here, we'll talk about the 1 out of 1,520 that crushed the Aztec Empire. However, generally, the spread of the infection across the globe made it a pandemic. In North and South America, smallpox required roughly 100 years to annihilate around 90% of the native individuals. In Mexico, the populace dropped to 1 million individuals from around 11 million preceding the European success. At last, the destructive infection assisted the Spanish with vanquishing the Aztecs and Incas in light of the fact that their populaces scarcely existed because of the disease. Centuries later, smallpox was the main infection pandemic halted by an antibody. In 1980, the World Health Organization proclaimed that smallpox had been killed across the globe. Number 6. Antonine Plague. Perhaps the deadliest pandemic in history is likewise one of the most seasoned. The Antonine Plague happened in 165 to 180 and at last ended the existences of around 5 million individuals. The Romans carried the infection back home with them after a battle with the Parthians. The illness began in Asia Minor and afterwards spread to Greece and Italy. For the following 20 years, the Roman Empire saw a flare-up not at all like anything they had ever experienced. At the pinnacle of the spread, they were seeing around 2,000 fatalities each day. It was assessed that 7 to 10% of the whole Roman Empire was killed, with higher rates in denser areas. The domains Coryllas Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus both kicked the bucket during this time span. Many have hypothesized that they were murdered by this illness. Albeit the illness that assaulted these individuals is obscure, numerous researchers trust it was a flare-up of smallpox. Number 5. Asian flu. In the 20th century, the second significant flu pandemic was the Asian influenza of 1957, also known as the Asian influenza pandemic. The flare-up was answerable for more than 1 million deaths. At the start of the Asian influenza pandemic, the infection spread all through China and the encompassing districts. Months after the fact, this season's virus had arrived at the United States and was far-reaching in the United Kingdom. Just 3 months into 1958, the United States had assessed that almost 70,000 passings were connected to the Asian influenza. An antibody was in the end built up that contained the pandemic. Number 4. The Great Plague. As a component of the Second Plague pandemic, the Great Plague of 1665 made pioneers close all open diversion and seal the wiped out in their homes to help forestall the spread of the sickness. In all, London lost about 15% of its populace. Albeit the city recorded roughly 69,000 passings, the real number is accepted to be over 100,000. When the plague showed up in a family, a red cross was painted on the entryway with the words, "Master, show kindness toward us." Later, the inert bodies were taken out and taken in a truck to a plague pit. Number 3. Black Death. Quite possibly the most obliterating pandemics in history was the Great Bubonic Plague, otherwise known as the Dark Death, during the 1300s. A destructive flare-up of the bubonic plague began in China during the 1330s. As the nation was one of the busiest exchanging countries, the sickness immediately spread elsewhere. By 1347, the Black Death had shown up in Europe after a few tainted boats moored at Messina, a Sicilian port. Only 5 years after the fact, the plague had murdered more than 20 million individuals in Europe. The Black Death is broadly accepted to have been brought about by Yersinia pestis microbes. The illness generally spread to individuals from the chomps of contaminated rodents and insects. From that point, it was profoundly irresistible among humans. The plague caused a fever alongside buboes, expanding of the lymph organs. The sickness additionally created rosy spots on the skin that turned dark, which is the reason individuals considered it the Black Death. Number 2. The Third Plague Pandemic. In 1855, during the Xianfeng Emperor's rule of the Qing administration, the Third Plague Pandemic started in China. This lethal bubonic plague at last went through India and Hong Kong, slaughtering in any event 12 to 15 million individuals. India endured the most setbacks with in excess of 10 million deaths. This was the third major bubonic plague flare-up to hit European culture. The infection was at first spread by insects during a mining blast in Yunnan, China. Losses from the Third Plague pandemic dropped to less than 200 every year in 1960. Around then, the World Health Organization verified that the plague was not, at this point, dynamic. Number 1. Spanish flu. The deadliest flu pandemic in history started in 1918 and infected about 1/3 of the world's population, or approximately 500 million people. Although estimates vary, it is believed that the Spanish flu killed about 50 million people, including almost 700,000 Americans. The first wave of the influenza occurred in spring 1918, and it was generally mild. The second wave was highly contagious and hit the world with a vengeance. The Spanish flu was initially seen in Europe, the United States, and Asia before spreading across the globe. Victims of the influenza were dying within hours and days of developing symptoms. The average lifespan in the US had decreased by 12 years after the Spanish flu had been around for only 1 year. Schools, private homes, and other buildings became makeshift hospitals due to overcrowding in medical facilities. Quarantines were imposed, people were ordered to wear masks, and businesses were shut down until the virus completed its deadly run.